You think ancient Greece was a country. It wasn't. It was never a country. Not once. Not for a single day in its entire history. That picture in your head, one flag, one king, one people in white robes nodding along to the same philosopher? That thing never existed. What actually existed was about 1,000 tiny towns crammed onto a pile of rocks, and most of them wanted the town next door wiped off the map. They didn't share a government. They shared a grudge. And the reason for all of it, the democracy, the wars, the marble, the whole golden mess you half remember from school, comes down to one boring fact: the dirt. So, look at a map of Greece for a second. It looks like somebody dropped a plate. Mountains everywhere. About 80% of the place is mountain, with little crumbs of flat farmland wedged in between, and a coastline so chewed up and full of islands that you're never far from the sea. Egypt had it easy. Egypt had the Nile, one enormous river that flooded on a schedule and dumped free farmland on everybody's doorstep. So naturally, everyone clustered along it and ended up under one king. A big river hands you a country. Greece got the opposite of a big river. Greece got rocks. Living crammed onto rocks like that does something to people. Each little patch of flat land sits in its own valley, walled off by mountains on every side. You settle there, you farm your scrap of dirt, and the next group of people over the ridge might as well be on the moon, because getting to them means days of climbing through passes that snow shut half the year. So you don't build one big kingdom. You build a town. Your own town, with its own laws, its own army, its own gods it likes best, even its own accent. And the town in the next valley does the same. And then you spend the next few centuries mostly annoyed at each other. The only easy way around all those mountains was the water, which is why the Greeks turned into sailors and ended up trading across the whole Mediterranean. But at home, on land, they stayed split into hundreds of stubborn little pieces that could not agree on lunch, let alone a country. That inability to chill, to ever just leave the next valley alone, is the engine of this whole story. But before any of the stuff you've heard of, the rocks had to grow some people. And the first real players weren't even on the mainland. They were on Crete, the big island down south, and we call them the Minoans. These people got rich the smart way, by trading across the sea instead of stabbing their neighbors, and they poured that money into one ridiculous building, a palace at a place called Knossos, so huge and so tangled with rooms and corridors and staircases doubling back on themselves that later Greeks looked at the ruins and decided, yeah, this was obviously a labyrinth built to hold a monster, half man and half bull, that ate people. That's where the Minotaur story comes from. The real palace just had really confusing hallways. They painted their walls with bright pictures of dolphins and young athletes vaulting clean over the horns of charging bulls for fun, which tells you these were not anxious people. And then, around 1600 BC, the island right next door, the one we call Santorini today, did not so much erupt as explode. One of the biggest blasts the ancient world ever saw. The shockwave threw up walls of water that rolled down onto Crete's coast and smashed the Minoan fleet, the ships their entire fortune floated on, into splinters. Turns out, building your whole golden civilization on boats has exactly one catastrophic failure mode, and the universe went and found it. They limp on for a while after that, wounded, and then the tougher kids from the mainland move in and take over. Those are the Mycenaeans, and they are nothing like the dolphin painters. These are warlords. They live in grim stone fortresses with walls so massive that later Greeks assumed only giants could have stacked the rocks. They bury their kings in gold death masks, and they are the ones who sailed off to fight a 10-year war over a city called Troy, the one every Greek legend you half remember keeps circling back to. They could even write. And what does a fierce warrior race do with the miracle of writing? Receipts, sheep counts, grain in, grain out. The scariest people in the Bronze Age, and they used the written word almost entirely for inventory. And then, the whole thing falls off a cliff. Around 1200 BC, the entire eastern Mediterranean comes apart at once. Nobody is fully sure why. Maybe raiders from the sea, maybe drought, maybe one kingdom collapsing knocked over the next like dominoes. Whatever it was, the palaces burn, the fortresses empty out, the trade routes die, and the population craters. And then, the Greeks forget how to write. A civilization that had scribes and archives and records just loses the skill completely. The writing stops. And it does not come back for around 400 years. For 4 centuries, nobody in Greece writes a single word down, because the world that needed accountants is gone. They have to wait until they're trading again with their neighbors over east, the Phoenicians, look at their alphabet, and basically go, "Oh, right, letters. We used to do this." The Greek alphabet, you sort of recognize, is a hand-me-down they borrowed to climb back out of the dark. And when they do climb out, the rocks pull their old trick again. They still can't unify at home, so instead they swarm outward. Greek towns start planting copies of themselves all over the map, from the coast of Spain to the shores of the Black Sea, like a civilization scattering seeds. They start holding a sports festival every 4 years at a place called Olympia, where, fun detail, the athletes competed completely naked and slathered in olive oil. And out of all this, the thing crystallizes that defines them: the polis, the city-state. Your town is your whole world and your whole identity. Out of all those squabbling towns, 2 ended up famous, and they were about as opposite as 2 places can get. Sparta decided to be one thing and one thing only: a military base. The entire town was a barracks with a society attached. So when a Spartan boy turned 7, the state took him from his mother, and that was it. Childhood over. They threw him into a brutal training system, half-starved on purpose, given one thin cloak a year and no shoes so his feet would harden. And the best part? They wanted the boys to learn cunning, so they were expected to steal food to survive. But if you got caught stealing, you were beaten. Not for stealing, for getting caught. The crime was being bad at it. The cleverest teenagers got pulled into a secret police force that was sent out into the countryside to terrorize and quietly murder the enslaved population that did all the farming, so that the Spartans could spend 100% of their time training to fight other Greeks. All that produced a people famous for 2 things: killing and not wasting words. When a Persian king demanded the Spartans hand over their weapons at a mountain pass, the Spartan king sent back 2 words: "Come and take them." Years later, when a warlord threatened them with a whole letter that ended, "If I invade, I will burn your city to the ground," the Spartans wrote back 1 word: "If." That's the whole reply: if. Athens went the other direction entirely. Athens looked at the idea of one man ruling everyone and decided, no, the people should run the place. Democracy. Rule by the demos, the people. But before you picture something noble and modern, look at how they actually ran it. They filled most government jobs by lottery, not by election, by random draw, like jury duty. Your name went in, and you might just get pulled out to help run the city for a year, whether you wanted to or not. And once a year, the whole assembly could vote to kick somebody out. If they thought any one man was getting too powerful, too popular, too much of a future tyrant, they each scratched his name on a broken piece of pottery, dropped it in a pile, and whoever got the most votes was exiled for 10 years. He got to keep his house and his money. He just had to leave. They called it ostracism after the pottery shards, the ostraca. And it got properly petty. There was a politician so honest that people literally called him Aristides the Just. And during one of these votes, a man who couldn't read walked up and, not recognizing him, handed Aristides a shard and asked him to scratch a name on it for him. Aristides asked, "Sure, whose name?" The man said, "Aristides." So Aristides asked him, calmly, "Has this Aristides ever wronged you?" And the man said, "No, I don't even know him. I'm just sick of hearing everyone call him the Just." And Aristides, without a word, wrote his own name on the shard and handed it back. He got exiled. The system was not always noble. We've even dug up a pile of these shards, all carved with one rival's name in only a few different handwritings, which means somebody was mass-producing them to rig the vote. They invented democracy, and they invented ballot stuffing at basically the same time. So you've got these hundreds of towns, the two biggest being a death cult and a chaotic experiment in mob rule, all of them squabbling. And then something shows up big enough to make them stop fighting each other. Briefly, Persia. Persia at this point is the largest empire the world has ever seen, and it decides these noisy little Greek towns need to learn some manners. The first time the Persians land an army in 490 BC on a plain called Marathon, the Athenians do something nobody expects. They win. In a single afternoon, this much smaller force smashes the invasion and sends it back across the sea. And you already know this battle, even if you don't know that you know it. Because a single runner took off from the field at Marathon and ran flat out all the way back to Athens, burst through the city gates, managed to choke out, "We are victorious!" and then dropped dead on the spot from the effort. That run is the reason a race of about 26 miles is called a marathon to this day. A guy ran himself to death just to deliver good news. Except the real version is somehow even more insane. The famous run actually happened before the battle. A messenger sprinted from Athens all the way to Sparta to beg for help, and that was around 150 miles across mountains in roughly 2 days. The dying at the finish line got stitched onto the story later because it hit harder that way. The truth was just a man running 150 miles and then calmly carrying on with his day. The Persians do not take the hint. 10 years later, the new Persian king comes back with a force so big, the old writers swore it drank rivers dry. And this is the one moment the Greeks almost get their act together. A few towns actually team up. At a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, a Spartan king and his 300 men, plus other Greeks the movies tend to forget, plug the gap and hold off the entire Persian army for days. Because in a pass that tight, numbers don't matter. Only the few men at the front can fight at a time. They only lose because a local traitor shows the Persians a secret goat path around the back, and the Greeks get surrounded. They die to the last man, but they buy the rest of Greece time, and that time gets used by an Athenian named Themistocles, who pulls off the smartest trick of the whole war. He lures the gigantic Persian navy into a narrow strait of water near an island called Salamis. And the second all those Persian ships crowd into that tight channel, their huge numbers turn into a traffic jam. They can't maneuver, they're bumping into each other, and the smaller, faster Greek ships row in and ram them to pieces. The invasion breaks. Persia goes home. The pile of rocks, for once working together, just beat the biggest empire on Earth. And then Athens hits the golden age everyone romanticizes. It comes out of that war flush with confidence and money, and it goes on a building and thinking spree we have not really shut up about since. They put up the Parthenon. They start arguing about everything in the open air. And while we're standing in front of all this, I have to ruin one more thing for you. Those statues. The perfect, glowing, pure white marble gods and athletes you picture. The whole clean white look you think of as ancient Greek taste. Wrong. The Greeks painted their statues. Loudly. Bright reds, deep blues, gold, skin tones, patterned clothes, painted eyes staring back at you. Their idea of a finished sculpture looked closer to a carnival than a museum. The white you see today is just the paint that wore off over thousands of years. And the worst part is what happened next. When people centuries later dug these statues up and found bits of color still clinging to them, they liked the clean white look so much
that they scrubbed the original paint off, on purpose, well into the 20th century. We didn't lose the color by accident. For a long time, we deleted it.
The arguing in the open air, though? That's the part that sticks. Athens is crawling with philosophers, and the most famous one, Socrates, basically went around the marketplace asking everyone smug questions until the city got so annoyed it put him on trial and made him drink poison. But my favorite of the bunch never wrote a thing and owned even less: Diogenes. The man decided that owning stuff and caring what people think was the whole problem with being human. So he lived in a big clay storage jar in the marketplace like a stray dog. He owned a cloak and a cup, and then one day he watched a child drink water using just his hands, and he threw the cup away too, furious at himself for carrying it around like a chump. He walked through town in broad daylight holding up a lantern, and when people asked what he was doing, he said he was looking for one honest man, and the joke was that he never found one. When the snobby philosopher Plato proudly defined a human being as a featherless animal that walks on two legs, Diogenes went and plucked a chicken, marched it into Plato's school, held up the naked bird, and announced, "Behold, Plato's man." And then there's the one I can't get over. A young conqueror named Alexander, who at that point ruled most of the known world, came to meet the famous Diogenes as a sign of respect, found him lying in the dirt sunbathing, and asked if there was anything at all he could do for him, anything in the world. Diogenes squinted up at the most powerful man on earth and said, "Yes, move, you're blocking my sun." But the Greeks, as always, could not enjoy winning. Athens and Sparta, the two heroes who'd just teamed up to save everyone, immediately turn on each other and drag the whole Greek world into a long, grinding war between themselves. It lasts a generation. It bleeds everyone dry. By the end of it, the great towns are exhausted, broke, and weaker than they have been in centuries, all because the rocks bred a people who would rather lose to each other than share a win. And that, finally, is what gets them conquered. Not by Persia, by the neighbors they'd always sneered at. Up north sat Macedonia, a kingdom the polished southern Greeks treated like hillbillies, rough people with funny accents. But Macedonia had one thing the south never did: room. Flatter land, the kind of open country where you actually can build a single, big, centralized kingdom, the thing the rocks had been preventing down south the whole time. So while the great towns were busy wrecking each other, a Macedonian king named Philip quietly built the most advanced army in the Greek world, marched south, and beat them. And just like that, the towns that had never bowed to anyone, the come and take them one-word answer, too proud to share a country towns, all of them, bowed. And Philip had no intention of stopping at Greece. He'd already turned to look east, at Persia itself, and was pulling together an army to go punish the empire that had once tried to swallow the Greeks. And then, at the wedding of his own daughter, in front of the whole court, one of his own bodyguards stepped up and stabbed him dead. So the throne, the army, and the half-built plan to march on Persia all dropped straight into the lap of his 20-year-old son, the one who'd told Diogenes to move. And this kid had been flagging that he was different since he was about 12. A horse trader brought a magnificent black stallion to the Macedonian court, named an outrageous price for it, and then watched as nobody could ride the thing. It reared and threw every grown man who climbed on, until Philip got fed up and ordered them to lead the useless animal away. And his 12-year-old son spoke up from the crowd, calling the adults cowards for throwing away a perfectly good horse. Philip, half annoyed and half amused, basically said, "Oh, you think you can do better? Fine. And if you fail, you buy it." So the boy walked up to the monster that had just humiliated a whole line of soldiers, and instead of grabbing at it, he watched it. And he caught the one thing every grown man had missed. The horse was terrified of its own shadow, flinching every time that dark shape shifted on the ground beside it. So he gently turned its head to face the sun,
so the shadow fell behind it where it couldn't see it, murmured to it, slid his cloak off his shoulders, and swung up onto its back. And he rode it. The whole court went from laughing at the boy to cheering for him. And his father, watching his son outthink a horse that had just beaten trained men, teared up and told him, "Son, you're going to have to find yourself a bigger kingdom, because Macedonia is too small for you." He even had Aristotle himself as a tutor, and it turns out Dad was right about the kingdom being too small.
He took that army east and went after Persia, the empire that had once tried to swallow Greece. And he did not stop. On the way, he hit a town with a knot tied so impossibly that an oracle had promised whoever undid it would rule all of Asia. He looked at it for a minute, then drew his sword and cut it in half. Problem solved. He beat the Persian king not once, but again and again. He rolled into Egypt, and the Egyptians crowned him pharaoh, set the double crown of their kingdom right on his head. He founded city after city, and, not big on modesty, named most of them after himself. There are something like 70 of them. He named one after his horse. He pushed on for 8 years, all the way into India. And that was where the unstoppable finally stopped, in the strangest way possible. Standing at a river in the pouring monsoon rain, his men 8 years and half a world from home, Alexander laid out the next plan. Keep going. East, further, all the way to the edge of the world. And his army, the men who had followed him across deserts and over mountains and straight through every force on earth, went quiet. Nobody cheered. Nobody moved. One of his most trusted officers stepped forward and said it flat out, that the men were spent, that they wanted to see their homes again before they died, that this was far enough. And the man who had beaten the largest empire on earth could not beat the silence of his own soldiers. So he stormed off to his tent and sulked there for days, waiting for them to come around. They didn't. And for the first time in his life, Alexander turned back. Not beaten by an enemy, beaten by tired men who simply sat down in the rain. And he never made it home either. Back in Babylon at 32 years old, master of the biggest empire the world had yet seen, he caught a fever and died. His body was so well preserved that in the brutal heat people swore it didn't rot for almost a week, which only fed the rumors that he'd been something more than human. He left no clear heir, and his generals did not waste a single day grieving. They carved the empire up between themselves like a stolen pie, and the whole thing splintered into rival Greek kingdoms, one of them in Egypt, run by the family of a general named Ptolemy. So now, Greek kings rule everything from Egypt to the edge of India, and Greek becomes the language of the educated world. And it would be a lovely place to end. Except there's a new kid in the West, lifting weights and learning fast. Rome. And Rome eats them. One kingdom at a time, over a couple of centuries, the Romans pick the Greek world apart. They burn the rich old city of Corinth flat to the ground in 146 BC, the very same year they wipe Carthage off the map, just to make the point. Greece becomes a Roman province, a possession. The last Greek kingdom left standing is the one in Egypt, still ruled by that Greek family 300 years later. And its final ruler is a name you already know, Cleopatra. And like we got into back in the Egypt video, she wasn't Egyptian at all. She was Greek, the last of Alexander's leftovers. And when she dies in 30 BC, the Greek world is officially, completely over. Conquered. Finished. A footnote inside somebody else's empire. Total losers. On paper. Except for what happens after. Because Rome conquered Greece, and then Rome quietly turned into Greece. The Roman gods are just the Greek gods with the names swapped. Roman temples, Roman statues, Roman theater, Roman philosophy, Roman schooling,
all of it lifted straight from the Greeks they'd beaten. The Romans won the war and then spent the next several hundred years trying to act Greek. The pile of rocks that could never run itself, that lost every single war for its own freedom, that got swallowed whole, ended up moving into the winner's head and running that instead. 1,000 towns that couldn't agree on lunch. And somehow you're still using their alphabet every time you text someone.